Good evening, you're watching The Digital Age, and I'm James Goodale. You know, the bloggers have been really picking on mainstream media, MSM. Dan Rather went down, Newsweek went down. The list is long. I want to talk about bloggers and mainstream media tonight, but I want to turn it around a little bit. I want to ask, are bloggers as trustworthy as mainstream media? And here tonight to discuss that question with me is Rebecca MacKinnon, who reported for CNN from China. She then became a blogger, and she presently is at the Berkman Center, where she does whatever you do at the Berkman Center and blogs, and we'll hear about more about that in a minute. But first, let's see what you looked like when you reported for CNN.
Sure, if you want. The report came just as the government was stepping up its crackdown against the Falun Gong meditation group. Some diplomatic observers here say the contradictory way in which different parts of the Communist Party and the government handled an erroneous report shows there's a difference of opinion in how much outsiders ought to be blamed for China's problems. Rebecca MacKinnon, CNN, Beijing.
So everyone asks, I'm going to ask too. I mean, you're a veteran of the net circuit. Every place you go, you can pick up Rebecca MacKinnon's name. Try it, audience. Go to Google and see. Why did you leave CNN? Is this because you're an infotainment baby?
Well, I mean, since you talk about infotainment baby, basically I left CNN because I was frustrated. I had been working overseas for over 11 years for CNN, in China for 9 years, and then in Japan for 2.5. I went into journalism, and I went into particularly international journalism because I wanted to build bridges between people. I wanted to build bridges of understanding. I wanted to help Americans put themselves in the shoes of people in China, put themselves in the shoes of people in Japan, Korea, Pakistan, other places where I reported, and try and understand events and why countries were reacting to things, perhaps maybe differently, why it was that people in different countries see the world differently than Americans might. But what I was finding increasingly, especially with the drive for ratings and a lot of cutbacks going on, that increasingly show producers were not so interested in what information I had to impart that might go against conventional wisdom, and there was more interest in having me reinforce stereotypes. And by the time I left, I was being told things like, Rebecca, your expertise is getting in the way of doing the kind of stories we want. We would prefer that you cover your area more like a tourist, and maybe you can write your scripts before you do your interviews. And I felt that this was not the reason why I went into journalism. And also, I think, increasingly with international news on American television, when it comes to serious news overseas, it's war reporting. There's really not much interest in complex stories from countries, regions at peace. So therefore, you get, if there aren't guys in turbans with AK-47s running around blowing things up, it's not an interesting story for the networks increasingly. And so, you said infotainment babe. I mean, it really looked like my career was going to have to go in one of two directions. If it would, it was a pretty good career. I was Beijing bureau chief and Tokyo bureau chief at a very young age. But to go anywhere from there, it looked like I was either going to have to be a war correspondent or an infotainment news bunny. And that serious journalism from nations at peace was just not something that there was interest in. At the same time, the reason why I became interested in blogs was that I discovered, particularly around the time that the U.S. went into Iraq, we were starting to see these blogs. There was a guy in Baghdad who had set up for free on blogger.com a site where he was every day talking about what was happening around him, how the people in his neighborhood felt about the impending bombings and then the bombings and what was going on. And there was initially some question as to whether or not he was who he claimed. That later got cleared up that he was who he claimed to be. But this was a way for an individual who was not in Iraq to get to know the perspective of another individual on the other side of the world without having to wait for a reporter to quote the guy or to put a soundbite up on television. And this is kind of the media revolution, in that journalists as intermediaries have lost a lot of power and control. That, you know, before, if you wanted to know what a Chinese person thinks, you had to wait for a journalist to report it, or you had to be privileged enough to have Chinese friends or travel to China. Now you can go to blogs where Chinese people, in some cases writing in English, are talking about their perspective on events. And yes, it's a very personal, firsthand perspective, and I don't think it's a replacement for objective professional news reporting, but I think it takes you there and puts you in the shoes of people in a way that you don't get from news reports, especially because increasingly a lot of parts of the world just aren't covered. And so anyway, about 2 years ago, I went on leave from CNN. Initially, I was just going to take some time off, do a fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School, and then go back. But I became so fascinated with what's happening on the internet and how this is really, I thought, going to revolutionize journalism, revolutionize media, that I decided that rather than, you know, going back to sort of being at the beck and call of my producers doing stories that I thought maybe weren't the real story, that I would try and be involved with figuring out where this is all going, and perhaps maybe helping to shape and influence where it goes in a good direction.
So I'll pick up the threads of the story there, and you started a blog.
Yep,
and
I did.
You now have 3 blogs, and this is a little bit ancient history, but the first blog you started was called North Korea Zone.
Right.
And I want to show that up on the camera so everybody can see it. Your present #1 blogging interest is Global Voices, and you also have a blog called Our Conversation. What was it like starting up a blog after you'd been a reporter? That must have been a strange experience.
That was very liberating.
It was liberating.
Yeah, incredibly so. Because, you know, when you're having to do your 2-minute 30 TV spots, you leave a lot out, right? So with North Korea Zone, I mean, I set that up as a place to exchange information and discuss issues related to news on North Korea. That it's a very complicated issue. It's really almost impossible to get into all the factors going on with North Korea's nuclear crisis and so on in a 2-minute story, especially because usually those factors include about 5 countries, and a TV producer only really wants you to talk about 2 of them because they're afraid that the listeners and viewers will get too confused if you mention too many things. And so I thought, you know, a blog was a great place to put out, you know, hey, you know, the so-and-so is reporting this, and so-and-so is reporting that, and this other person has just come out of North Korea with this first-hand account, and here's the link to that. And these things don't add up, and let's discuss it, and let's dissect it, and let's try and figure out what this means. And yeah, it's a way of drilling down into a story, and you don't have millions of viewers the way you have on CNN. You might have 500 or 1,000 of readers per day, which is what I had with North Korea Zone. But the people following the blog were people, a lot of journalists, a lot of people on Capitol Hill, people who follow policy. And I was finding that discussions that I and my readers in the comments were having about North Korea-related events were having an impact on some of the stories people were doing related to North Korea and on some of the policies that people were discussing. And so that while I wasn't having this huge mass impact, I was able to have a specific impact.
Narrowcasting.
Narrowcasting.
But what I don't tell me what I don't understand. How did anyone find your blog? I mean, there's blogs have created some horrendous rate, 1 blog a minute or something like that. There's literally millions of them.
Well, a lot of people were finding me through Google. They were doing Google searches on North Korea and specific topics, and they were winding up on my blog. And one of the things about blogs is that they have so many incoming and outgoing links, because what happens if you post something on your blog that a number of people find interesting, who also have blogs, they'll all link to you. So it kind of virally spreads around. And there's actually a chart I like to show at presentations that kind of goes like this. And there's like this long tail, and then you know, there's mass media up here, and then there are all these blogs with, you know, audiences of a few dozen people, sort of way off in the long tail. And what happens is you'll have a conversation or something interesting that'll come up on a blog out in the long tail. And then, blogs with slightly larger audiences will link to that. And then blogs with slightly more sizable audience will link to that. Well, yeah, it's a web of links across, and so stuff will spread virally, and then suddenly a reporter who's following a certain number of political blogs or what foreign policy blogs will see the link going back to your blog. And then they'll do a story about it, and before you know it, it's in the mass media. And this has happened to me quite recently with my personal blog, Our Conversation, where I've been talking quite a lot about China and censorship issues, that, I would link to certain very specific cases of censorship going on in China in the internet, and then other bloggers would say, hey, Rebecca MacKinnon just found out about this thing. This is, a huge concern. Microsoft just went and censored this Chinese blogger, and then everybody's linking to it, and then virally, it becomes a huge conversation. People are emailing the link around, and then journalists pick up on it, and it gets in the media, and it becomes a story.
Do you feel that you're chained to your blogs? In other words, before you were a blogger, you spoke anonymously. But now you have all these people that perhaps you think depend a little bit on what you're saying. Do you feel that you have to keep going all the time? In other words, what are you doing here talking to me? Why aren't you back on your blog? Doesn't it take all your time?
Well, there are different kinds of bloggers, and I think one of the mistakes people make is that they assume all bloggers do the same thing. It's like assuming all TV shows do the same thing. There are so many different kinds of, you could be chained to a TV show, and then you might not be chained to a TV show, depending on what the show is, right? Or your TV show could be credible, or it could be highly uncredible, depending on who you are, and what the show is meant to do. And so same with blogs. And I'm not the kind of blogger who, there are some people with blogs who are in the habit of posting several times a day on all kinds of things and feel obligated to do so. On my own personal blog, I post when I have something unique to say, and I get into a bit more depth. And I may go for several days without posting.
But not more than several days?
Well, it depends.
How do you take a vacation? Don't answer.
This is a complete misperception about blogs. Most bloggers are not posting every day.
They're not.
It's only a very small percentage of people who are on their blogs all the time. And, again, it depends on what you're trying to do with your blog. Because with my personal blog, I use it as my space to share ideas and information with people who might be interested. I'm not trying to gain a huge mass audience. I'm not trying to make money with my blog. I am trying to enhance my reputation as an expert in certain areas. But that's very different than trying to be a 24-hour news service, which I'm not trying to do with my blog. There are some other bloggers who are trying to do that. I'm not. And so, I post when I want. And it's much freer than when I worked for CNN, when a producer could call me up at 3 in the morning and force me to go do a story I thought was idiotic.
Okay, let me turn this around, because this is the positive side of blogging. Because we have a highly qualified person who's doing, very serious stuff on her blogs, or his blogs, if the case may be. There's a whole world of blogs out there, and I want to turn it over and look at the other side of it, and whether these blogs are reliable. Perhaps a good example of the unreliability of blogs would be the bloggers' report following the last presidential election that the exit polls showed that Kerry won.
Right.
And so my question is, what do you do about false information on the blog?
Well, as a journalist, you got to look at a blog as a source. So if some guy you interview says, I heard from the exit polls that such and such and such and such, you check it out. Caveat emptor. You don't believe anything until you've verified it. And this is the case with a Wire story that comes out with breaking news, and it's the case with blogs. But a blog is just it's a cheap web page that any individual can put up. And no, you shouldn't trust any source of information, be it a TV show or a blog, until you know something about that individual who's either running the TV show or running the blog. Whether they have any credibility. How do we know that this person has any idea what they're talking about? And until you have some judgment about that, no, you shouldn't believe anything they write. And I don't think anybody should believe anything on my blog until they've verified that I'm a credible person to talk about what I'm talking about. And so I think this is one thing that people kind of confuse, is that I think actually most blogs are not claiming to be the same thing as the New York Times. It's more like conversation and rumor swapping. And again, you have to triangulate. You have to, if anybody who's relying on one or two blogs as their source of all information is crazy.
Let me read what the Poynter Institute has said about bloggers. Bloggers in particular are loose cannons when it comes to information that established media seeks to control. Mostly independents with no corporate masters to abide, and often with no traditional journalistic training or standards.
Sure.
Now, your answer to that criticism is basically you've got to know who your sources are. But is that really, does that really work when you have zillions of blogs up there churning out all sorts of information, some which is terrific, as in your case, but others which are just absolutely false?
I get the sense that you're trying to, sort of prove that, blogs are not a credible thing. It's like saying people are not a credible thing. Look.
I'm trying to establish the level
I
of
run
credibility.
a site called Global Voices Online, globalvoicesonline.org, and what we try to do is to be a clearinghouse for conversations happening on blogs outside the United States and Western Europe, because we think that's sort of, there's a need to fill sort of a gap. We don't think American blogs need any more attention, but we think it's worth kind of helping people find credible bloggers in other parts of the world. And it's very, very interesting because we have a network of bloggers who supply us with links to what they think are the most interesting blog posts in Iraq or in Malaysia or whatever. And one thing is really, really clear, that most bloggers do not consider themselves journalists. And they do not want to be held to the same standards as journalists. That they are people who have an opinion or who have a perspective, and they're talking about it. And they think their perspective is credible. They might have information that's unique. They might have eyewitnessed something. They might commit certain acts of journalism at certain times. But they consider their blog to be their conversation space. Yeah, in which information, is part of the conversation. But it's, again, you have to know, you can't say, again, I come back to the same analogy. We could be having the same conversation about TV talk shows. Why should anybody trust TV talk shows? I mean, it's an overgeneralization. There are some TV talk shows that I trust tremendously. There are others that, I'm not going to believe a single word that's said on that show. And it's the same thing. You can't overgeneralize and say, oh, blogs are useless or blogs are useful.
No, I've got a different point. This is the first time in history where we've had the printed word, blogs are print, the printed word distributed in such volume.
Right.
Individually. Okay, so it's a whole
professionals have lost control.
It's a whole new phenomenon. Now, the protection we had in the past with respect to accuracy depended on really an entity, not a zillion people. And so you could deal with the entity. Now you have a zillion people out there saying a zillion things, including a wrong statement about the election. And I would say the bloggers, generalizing again, have said a lot of wrong things about mainstream media.
Sure.
And have caused mainstream media to take a dive when they shouldn't have taken a dive.
Well, this is the other thing. I think if there's wrong information going on the blogs and journalists report it as fact, that's the journalist's fault, doing bad journalism. And they should treat what bloggers are saying like
but the bloggers talk to each other.
Yeah, but
they don't have to talk just to the press.
No,
so
but you know what I'm saying?
With the wrong facts.
Right, no, that's very true. And it telescopes wrong facts. But in some cases, in other cases, it telescopes actual information. Now, I think we're kind of in a chaotic period right now.
I was going to say.
Because this is a very new phenomenon. Media has become democratized in a way that nobody's familiar with. I think the viewer slash user slash reader out there is feeling very overwhelmed and doesn't know what to trust. And I think over the next few years, we're going to see websites and other forms of media emerging that act as clearinghouses and help you figure out what you can believe, and who are culling the web and the blogosphere for what those conversations are, and then fact-checking on stuff and saying, you know, here's the story coming off the Iraqi blogs, and we checked it out, and this aspect of it is right, and this aspect of it isn't. This is another form of journalism that really needs to happen on top.
I mean,
and
that's like Global Voices in a way.
Which is in a way. I mean, we don't have the manpower to go in and fact check what's happening on all blogs around the world, but what we're doing is that we have this sort of set of bloggers who are considered credible in their regions, and that they're kind of linking to what they think are trusted sources. So yeah, we're trying to develop that model, but this is why, you know, there are some bloggers out there who are like, yeah, we're going to destroy journalism, and, you know, MSM is dead, and yay, yay. That's completely ridiculous.
But
and
they're
that would
there.
be, well, sure they're there. Well, you know,
But what do you do about them?
well, they have a right to say whatever they want. But you know what?
Even if they're even if they're false.
Let me finish. Yeah, sure. You know, but it's a free market of information, and I think, you know, bad information, you follow it with good information. What are you going to do? Censor them? I mean, you know, what's going to happen? And this is why journalism is going to survive, I believe. And it's also why we need professional journalism to survive. Because yes, you have this huge conversation happening out there, but ultimately the market really wants some credible sources that can help them figure this out without having to spend all day triangulating to figure out who they can trust and who they can't. So ultimately, you are going to have filters. You are going to have professionals you can rely on to sift through this cacophony, which is why, you know, right now we're sort of in this period where, you know, and mainstream media has come under attack for some legitimate reasons. I mean, a lot of reporters have gotten pretty lazy about misquoting people, and, you know, nobody really has much recourse, and so on. I mean, you know, it's the same thing. There are good journalists who are reliable and credible, and there are bad journalists who don't deserve to have the power that they have. And so, you know, again, I think we overgeneralize by putting journalism here and bloggers there. I think it's really great that blogs are forcing journalism to be more transparent. And, you know, it's really great now that what happens if I get interviewed and if I'm quoted out of context, I can go on my blog and post the transcript of the whole interview and prove that I got quoted out of context. Now, there's some journalists don't like that, but I think it's really good for the public that I can do that. That's real value.
But what do you do with the false information that sits out there with the blogs that they don't correct?
Well, you know,
let me just kind of give you just one example from mainstream media. It's pretty clear to me that it's a fact that the Quran was mistreated, and that it was, if it wasn't flushed down a toilet, it's hard to imagine a Quran going down a toilet. There's pretty good information that it was thrown in latrines. When Newsweek said that, there was a riot. Newsweek took it back because the bloggers kicked them around.
Was it just the bloggers? I think it was more the bloggers. It was like Middle Eastern governments and mobs and so
plus
on.
Bloggers.
Yeah.
Okay. Then two weeks later, the government admitted that the Quran had been mistreated, and we had the riots all over again. But as a matter of sort of accepted fact, if you take what Mr. Rumsfeld said before the Council of Foreign Relations not recently, it's a fact that Newsweek was wrong, but Newsweek wasn't wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was sort of getting into perhaps specifics of the story versus the general story, which was right, but maybe some of the specifics were wrong. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tactical manipulation that happens with bloggers. You know, there are right-wing bloggers and left-wing bloggers, and the right-wing bloggers kind of rally around their cause and get on message and kind of pound on something, and the left-wing bloggers do the same thing. Most of the time they're being pretty open about their biases, not always. But again, that's why you don't want to rely on any one blog for all your information. But again, you know, is it the fault that there are blogs that this misinformation happened, or is it the fault that there are a lot of people in this country who want to believe things that aren't true?
Well, it may be so. But let me ask, we're trying to figure out a solution to a problem that may be out there. Your solution is an interesting one. We have the global voices will ultimately triumph, and they will be the clearinghouse for the respectable blogs, and the others will not be heeded. Let me ask you about another solution that's been bandied about recently, and that is taking the internet service provider, which gets you to the blogs, like let's say Google, okay, and make Google responsible as an ISP, it's called, for the material which it effectively publishes. Now, the reason for making that argument would be that it was made before, in fact, the...
But it's not publishing material, it's linking to it.
Well, call it publishing, just for the sake of
yeah,
argument.
but legally, it's a very different thing to link to something than to publish it.
Let me just leave the legalities.
But that's important.
Well,
but I'm sorry, go ahead and make your point, but I think it's extremely important.
Well, legally, what happened was that the rule was the other way around. When the law first started with respect to the net, the Googles were liable. Congress changed it, okay? So now I'm suggesting, what happens if Congress changes it back? What do you think of that as a solution? That would put a tremendous burden on ISPs.
I think it doesn't work, you know, because how are they supposed to go through every single website on the web and vet it before they make it viewable through their search? I mean, there are millions of websites being created every day. There are millions of blogs. That would effectively mean that every time you create a blog, you have to go and register and go through some vetting process that's, that is going to be filtered through individuals with biases and so on. And very quickly, we're getting into, 1984 situations that I don't even want to think about. I tend to believe that over time, and again, we're in a very chaotic situation right now, but I think over time systems will be devised. There's already a lot of people working on technologies that enable viewers and users within systems to do sort of recommendation systems and credibility rankings and so on, that's much more distributed, because I think if you put the control in a centralized place for what the public can and cannot see, then you're turning into China pretty fast, whether or not that's your intention.
He's turning into old-fashioned media, you could say also. What do you think of this statement which you see on the blogs, in the blogosphere all the time? Recognizing there's a problem with respect to what I would call false information, not opinion. I mean, the blog, there's just no argument that the opinions on the blog are fantastic. They're totally...
well, it depends on, there's some fantastic and there's some completely ridiculous,
deal with
depending
opinion
on the blogger.
by responding to the opinion. The problem is with facts, false facts. What you see on the blogs quite a bit, and there's going to be very short answers, we've got to go, is that one great big libel suit will clear out the whole air, and then we'll be all set because we won't do it anymore.
It's possible.
Possible.
It's possible.
Right. Well, now I'm going to say goodbye to you, Rebecca, and thank you for coming. I want to ask you this question. I know you don't want to answer it, but I'll ask you anyway. Are bloggers as trustworthy as mainstream media? Yes or no?
I think that's the wrong question.
That's the wrong question.
Answered.
Thank you very much for coming.
It's a misguided question completely.
Thank you for coming by, and come by next week and learn more about the digital age. We would hope at that time to have correctly guided questions, and I look forward to seeing you next week. James Goodale, good night.